Good evening, everyone. My name is Jordana Mendelson. I am director of NYU's KJCC, a center dedicated to Spain and the Spanish-speaking world. On behalf of Marina Garde, assistant director, and Laura Torregano, special projects officer, I welcome you to the opening of Gabinete Fang project and tonight's roundtable discussion on the origin, context, and response to the project with curator Jorge Blasco, Benita Sampedro Vizcaya, Jane Anderson, and Kristen Joy Owens. In the interview that Jorge recorded with Estela del Carmen Mbesa Ale, a 22-year-old activist from outside of Barcelona, who is an Afro-descendant Spaniard, her father is from Cameroon and her mother is from Equatorial Guinea, she responded to the archival cards, which you've seen on exhibit across the hall in KJC's conference room. These cards, which created a catalog of tattoos of the Fang people and were made in 1957 by Barcelona's Ethnological and Colonial Museum by the draftsman Jose Barbera Farras, who manually redrew the original drawings by Jordi Sabater EP. Those cards that Estela responded to have not been exhibited before in Spain or the United States, have been kind of kept out of view, intentionally or unintentionally. It's something we could talk about in the museum's offices. I encourage you to listen to Estela's full interview. You can do that if you go out into the exhibition and you can scan the barcode. There is select transcription as well as in Spanish of some of that recording for those of you who may not understand Spanish. There's a rich amount translated into English. Estela makes many powerful observations. I also would note that she's about the same age of the students who worked with us in this project, and I found a great amount of parallel between the questions that she brought to the table and those that were raised in our seminar about these same materials. Her observations, which register dismay and rejection, as well as curiosity and affection for the representation of the Fang people, her people, through a specifically colonialist and dictatorial framework, that of Spain during the 1950s. She remarked, and I'm going to cite a few excerpts from that interview, so I'll do this when I'm her, not her, but voicing her words. She remarked, "What bothers me about the catalog is that a lot of context is missing." And about the existence of the archive, she observed, "They have to be preserved. Otherwise, we would erase something that situates us. They have taken a lot away from us by making the colonial history of Equatorial Guinea invisible." On the possible role that she and other members of her community might play in activating this archive, she added, quote, "The drawings should be redrawn with the Afro-descendant community that lives here," meaning around Barcelona, "so that we can know where we came from, to become aware of how white people see us." I want to publicly thank and acknowledge Estela. She is just one voice, but without her voice, we would be missing a sense of dialogue that we hope can continue over the course of this exhibition. The time that she took with Jorge and the privilege we have to include her voice in this project. Many of the questions she raises we hope to touch upon in this roundtable and the months to come as we encourage conversations about this project, including the one that we are holding tomorrow as part of our Fridays on the Patio program with Jorge, our Andres Bello chair, Mario Rufer. Mario, thank you for joining us tonight. And Claire Joffe, who's also here with us tonight, who is academic chair of the Museum Studies Student Organization. Before we move to our roundtable, I would like to add a few acknowledgments. A project like this has had the support of many colleagues and numerous students during the months-long process since Jorge first brought the idea to the KJCC. At NYU, I would like to thank our staff at KJCC, who works tirelessly to put together a wonderfully rich series of programs and conversations. In addition to Marina and Laura, of course, there's also our staff, Luis, and our student assistants, Juan Manuel, who is also helping tonight. Jackson, Sarah, and Maya are indispensable to what we do. Arts and Science provided critical support in the form of an FAS teaching grant when we introduced this material last semester within the context of an advanced undergraduate class in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. I want to thank Dean Merlo, Dean Anton, Dean Chowdhury, and Lucy Alpert, who's also thankfully joining us today to see the fruits of that support. They have especially been leaders in drawing attention to faculty development and support of innovative teaching practices. We thank the Center for the Humanities and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, especially Uli Baer, Molly Rogers, and Gabriela Bastera. We are grateful for the collaboration of the Museu Etnològic y de Cultures del Món, the MUEC in Barcelona. That is the contemporary name for the institution that evolved from the original Museum of Ethnology and Colonialism that this archive for which this archive was made in the 1950s. Carlos Vicente, director, and Miquel Soberon, curator, were key contributors to our classroom discussion. They came in virtually and spoke to the students, and they also afforded Jorge access to this archive. So without their cooperation, we wouldn't have a project to discuss. We thank our guest speakers to the spring seminar who shared their knowledge not only in class, but granted us permission to include excerpts from their presentations on the website. Inez Plasencia and Muriel Gomez Pradas. I'd encourage you, if you can make your way through the website and the keywords, to listen to their words. They're really very insightful about the questions that drive this project. And Iñaki Tofino, who is an expert on Equatorial Guinea, who also lent his scholarship to the site. We'd also like to thank the participants of tonight's programming and this coming November's event, Jane Anderson, who is with us tonight, Caroline Colhoun, who will come in November, Kristen Joy Owens, and Benita Sampedro Vizcaya, and who also, I should say, Benita has been a really generous interlocutor for me as I've been entering into what is new terrain for me, thinking about the questions that are raised in being a scholar of Spain who is interested in what's happening in Equatorial Guinea. So Benita, thank you for coming not only to last seminar's class, but also my huge 150 student class in the fall. You have been really a great supporter of bringing that material to students. I want to now just make a note that Kristen actually is not able to join us tonight. She got sick just this afternoon, but she sent me her questions. So while she cannot be here in person, I have her questions that are really interesting and important additions. If you don't know Kristen, she is the librarian for African American and Black Diaspora Studies at NYU, whose research and curatorial activities explore the intersections of Black cultural studies, fashion studies, and the visual arts. And so we really miss that she can't be here with us in person, but we'll be thinking about her as we ask her questions. Now, before we go into the conversation itself, I'd like to just briefly introduce our other speakers and to remind you that following this discussion, we'll be having a reception outside with some really yummy food, which is something to look forward to. So we're going to nourish our minds and then nourish our bellies. Jorge Blasco, who is the curator of the Gabinete Fang project, is also the KJCC's 2023-24 Scholar in Residence at KJCC this year, and has been creating public exhibitions about archives within the framework of his Culturas de Archivo project for over 20 years. Benita Sampedro Vizcaya is a professor at Hofstra University, whose scholarship and support of research and writing about Equatorial Guinea has been so important to so many of us. And whose research is featured also on the Gabinete Fang website. Jane Anderson, who is faculty in NYU's Department of Anthropology and Museum Studies, focuses on the philosophical and practical problems for intellectual property law and the protection of indigenous traditional knowledge resources and cultural heritage in support of indigenous knowledge and data sovereignty, and she has written extensively on museum and archive. So these are going to be the scholars who are going to help us and guide us in this conversation. We will also have plenty of room for questions after their presentations. So I'd like to ask Jorge to kick us off.
Thank you, Jordana. I will not torture with my English for a long time, so don't worry. Many thanks to the staff of the institution, to the students, and to everybody who already mentioned. So the time is not so long. I will not repeat, but it has been a very, very special experience, a paradise for our independent researchers as I am. Let's talk about the topic, maybe. The title of this intervention is Remembering What? So it's Gabinete Fang, but in this moment we are talking about remembering what. You will see why. First of all, I would like to show you one of the Sabatepi, the originals, drawings, were like this. Sweeter, softer than the other you have seen, which are copies of Sabate. But Sabater was in charge of cataloging the Fang tattoo, and he changed completely the style of the drawings. So remember this image, don't forget it, because you will find another Sabater EP, another person, completely different drawing. This is you have it there, so I will not spend very many time on this image, but notice this sketch. It means silence of the cards. It means that from 1978, in this case, to 1992, the cards were disappeared in the deep storage of the museum. 58. Yeah, 58. So it means something. Franco time material that nobody wants to take out from the archive to visualize. Uh, Let me continue. Sabate EP drawings. This is one of Sabate EP catalog works. As you see, it's very different to the way the caricaturex way he was using for the other drawings. So I will read, which is easier for me and nicer for you. The drawings between 1949 and 1956, the Catalan primatologist Sabater P. proceeded to the study and analysis of the tattoos and scarifications of the Fang of Equatorial Guinea, Colony, Protectorate, and Spanish province consecutively. It was a soft approach to the cultural phenomenon, contemplated with the slippery approach of art. The word art is always present in Sabatepi, in Barbara, in everybody approaching to Africa somewhere, somehow, sorry. On the results was a series of catalog sheets where the tattooed part was drawn generally in the face, and information was given about the meaning of the tattoo as well as its name in the native language as known to the author. Uh, Sabatepi was a young boy when he moves to Africa, to Guinea, to Spanish Guinea of the time, and he learned the language of the Fang, and he had a good relation with the Fang, so that's why it was so easy for him to make these portraits. The seats also contain less formal annotations, like in the case of a drawing of a woman head that had the following at the bottom of the page. The woman refused to give information and left very angry about the drawing. Stella was very surprised about this drawing because she could understand very well what does it mean to be the model of a colonial uh, draftsman or primatologist in this case. Uh, the cars, Barbara cars. These are Barbara cars. The tattoo drawing would later be reproduced in ruled cars with a high cataloging, positivist, and anthropological aspect. Thus, later the draftsman Barbara would make copies of the drawings, more hieratic than those of Sabater, in cars of the graphic catalogue of the museum. In size, the cars are 18 per 24 centimeters, sorry for the measure, and contained the following fields, which were not handwritten but instant time written. For me, this is very important, the design of the information. It's not only the information, but how do you design it. The fields were town, locality, subject, age, group, culture, and I invite you to see there. Culture means Black African. So Equatorial Guinea is a small country like this, Africa is like this, but for Barbara and Sabate, culture was Black African. Serious complementary data, provenance, photo or drawing, accurate or deposit, date, in addition to various annotations that appeared in Sabater's original drawings of diverse nature, as the one I mentioned. These notes were transcribed, typed on index cards, and a formal and hard tone was given to the annotations, more bureaucratic. In reality, they should not be treated as copies of Sabater's sheets, but as translation and iconographic documentary and cataloging descriptions. This is the main word and concept in this work. Descriptions with their own style and as happen in any translation or description. Design is language. The support is language. Container and container are translated into the cards in a way that reflects a more distant and harder position than that of Sabater, who had established some kind of affection with the models by living in Guinea, living with them and speaking their language. If we take Barbara cards as an ethnographic test, they undoubtedly give many clues to the relationship of him with the Fang. These cards are tools that represent the original drawings and that, like any description, reveal the relationship with the represented person, which in turn gives an account of the general mentality of the country or the metropolis. Barbara never traveled to Africa. He was a servant, public servant. So he worked at the Archaeological Museum, at the Ethnological Museum, Colonial Museum. So he was a kind of very good mirror of the mentality of the time. They silently represent a way of seeing the Fang world through archival tools. And that's very important for me. This is not an exhibition on Equatorial Guinea. It's an exhibition on archival tools. Uh, well, it's an exhibition on whatever you want. You are free. But for me, it's an exhibition on archival tools. The Museum of Santa Isabel. You will see now, in, you see there, Cultura Negroafricana. It has the taste of the time somehow. Okay, the drawing are vanishing. The Museum of Santa Isabel. Sabater's cataloging of tattoos did not go unnoticed by the colonial authorities, who requested photographic copies to be exhibited in the Museum of Santa Isabel in Guinea. A document from the Anthropological Archive records the whole process in a file with the prices of the reproductions and with the writing list of items to be photographed. This is the smallest stage of the description of the bodies, personalities, and tattoos of the Fang, a real vice of the list that dispense with any iconographic reproduction and only resorts to the written, hard and dry to describe what was to be sent to the Museum of Santa Isabel. So this is, we are not sure that this exhibition happens, but it will be our sister exhibition because the exhibition you could visit there is the next exhibition from Santa Isabel one. Okay, you will see here that only the descriptions of the tattoos are used and the bodies are disappearing. a student of Jordana's course, lesson, class, uh, wrote a brilliant essay on this, on how cataloging documents, tattoos, make bodies disappear, vanish. You can find it in the website of the project. The book. Well, in 1992, this is a very important year for Spanish people because it was Olympic Games. Olympic Games means multiracial, all this we know. We don't know if it's for real, but this is what television tell us, that is gathering every kind of people together uh, in the name of the sport. Um, the book, The Tattoos of the Fang of the Western Guinea, art, symbolism, art again, symbolism and biology in a little known artistic again manifestation by Sabate P. Jordi and Sabate Ikoka Jordi, who was his son. It includes several drawings made as professor in ink. It's a third copy. The drawings are based on the originals, but it's a third copy. And something that Stella was very surprised in the originals and in Barbara copies is the fact that they don't have pupils. But in this case, they included pupils. So something had changed in their minds. But the book is quite colonialist in the year of the Olympic Games. They are not very informed drawings. As you can see, the information about the drawings is very data, not any narrative about the fun. And in all the phases, the collection of data is prioritized over any type of narrative. In the words of Sabatei P, we choose to reproduce according to the originals, always located on the right side of the plate. The outline of the tattoo located on the left side, accompanied by a documentary record containing the ethnographic data known about the subject under study. But sorry, but I have to tell again that it's 1992 and the logical theories have changed a lot. And this man, Zapatepi, is a kind of idol in Catalonia. So I don't know if I will be able to go back. Yes, artistry and some phrases like this. In those years, the Fang or Pamu Indians of the interior, many of them not yet, this is a word I really cannot pronounce, but I'll do my best, Europeanized, so they were not European enough. Phrases that these say in 1992 put the reader on guard about the whole approach to the tattooed fan. It's said to be a very friendly approach, but I find a lot of violence in all this archival process and on all this copy of the copy of the copy of the copy, but nothing changed. A neutral file falls short with all the information we have today, and that does not provide information on the conditions of production and context of these drawings and copies of tattoos. In the words of Ketelaar is an archivist from the Netherlands, in the text Tacit Narratives, the social, cultural, economic, and religious context determine the tacit narratives of an archive. These contexts should be made transparent, even visible, as done in a museum that attempts to represent the context in which this or that artifact was made. For me, this is main problem of this group of documents, that the museum may change the way they are treating this collection, the way they describe it, uh, the software they're using to describe it, because the descriptions are of Sabbath and in a very classical way, but Barbara, which is the hero of this exhibition, is not described at all, and is another step in the archival problematic of this museum. Reason for continue. Citing Beth Kaplan, Ketelar states, reasonably critical of the lack of guidelines that require archivists to document their decisions, reveal their methods, and explain their assumptions, and also reconstruct the path that documents follow from their creation to the archive, and as Laura Miller claims, to restore the connection between the reality of documents in the hands of their creators and that of those same documents in archival institutions. It's a copy of what you can see there outside. Memory. And here we go with what are we remembering, or remembering what. Laura Miller in 2004 wrote a fundamental essay on the erroneous identification between archive and memory. Archives are not memory, and this is fundamental to understand the background we work with, we all, in this project. It's true that they are always there on the verge of being something, but they are emphatically not memory. They contain documents and records that in turn construct tacit narratives that must be made visible, as Ketelar states, but they are not memory. It's the last page. What they contain are triggers for memory. Memory is an act. The document is an item. As such, memory occurs when the archive occurs by setting its records in motion. Somehow we are doing with this small installation, activating documents that are not being activated in the local place where they belong. We are activating the memory of our way of thinking and an archival method, not of an event of or a country. I will read to finish some of the Stella sentences. The description don't say anything. They don't tell a story. They don't say what they represent for the community. They could be hierarchy, motherhood, marriage, etc. It would be necessary to incorporate our gaze into the study. Somehow should know the use of these tattoos. What bothers me about the catalog is that a lot of context is missing. They have to be preserved, otherwise we would erase something that situates us. They have taken a lot away from us by making the colonial history of Equatorial Guinea invisible. It is a point of view that I cannot understand. Maybe a white person can understand it, but I can. I don't understand it. I don't understand it, and my head is going to keep wondering about it. They are a sample of folklorization of what is non-Western, a social expression that becomes, and I finish with this word, art. Thank you very much, and sorry for my English.
Thank you. When I wanted to thank Jorge, of course, for bringing the material here to New York, and Jordana for coordinating the project, and the students in your course for helping to develop it online, plus all the participants and scholars that collaborated in the project, and all of the audience here today. The Gabinete Fang exhibit on display here at the King Juan Carlos Center is a condensed archival display of an early 1950s collection of colonial drawings featuring human faces, limbs, and other body parts, including necks, backs, and chests, imprinted with body iconography, grosso modo described as tattoos. These drawings reflect the curiosity of the Spanish ethnologist Jordi Sabater Pi in the context of Spanish interventions in Africa, and they are currently part of the colonial archival collection of the Museo Etnológico y de las Culturas del Mundo in Barcelona, formerly known as the Museo Etnològic i Colonial. The collection of drawings was generated by Sabater Pi among a fan community in the central West African region of Rio Muni, at the time under Spanish colonial rule. These drawings bear the imprint of a colonial European male gaze and of a surreptitious visual engagement conditioned by power dynamics rendered on paper in his notebooks. They are paired with succinct cataloging cards, which provide the date of the encounter between the artist, ethnologist, and the fan individual, along with location, clan affiliation, and occasional brief descriptions. Several questions inevitably emerged from the start. What forms of colonial appropriation might be involved in observing, rendering, cataloging, and interpreting of this material? What is the implication of institutions and state agencies in managing, archiving, circulating, and re-signifying holdings of this nature? What is at stake in a renewed contemporary interest in tattoos in New York City today, far removed from the original political and material context in which these drawings and archival practices were put into motion? How, finally, might we most productively engage with the ongoing history of colonial interventions through the recirculation of archival artifacts and the traffic in meaning they reproduced? Not least, how do the fan peoples themselves, those of the past and those of today, enter into our reflection on this material? In this context, a disclaimer is essential. I am not a fan person. I do not speak fan beyond a few words. I have not been trained in fan anthropology, although there are a few expert colleagues that do so, and I am not in a position to address that field's past interpretations of fan cultural and societal practices. The repertoire of images that I am about to display in the PowerPoint can be problematized in many different ways, as it might implicitly invoke forms of perpetuating past violence through the privileging of some representations over others, or through the establishment of hierarchies of knowledge. However, I have chosen to assume this risk for pragmatic purposes to help situate what I perceive as some of the issues involved complex trajectories and past modes of intervention of this archival corpus. The Fang people, conventionally referred to as Pauing, Pangwe, or Pamwe in French, German, and Spanish colonial historiography, and also known as the Beti, inhabit a region comprising southern Cameroon, northern and central Gabon, as well as much of the colonially drafted territorial square called Rio Muni, which by the year 1900 had been incorporated into the Spanish territories of the Gulf of Guinea. European colonization, German, French, and Spanish alike, traversed Fang territory, clans, communities, and households, informing the current political and geographical configuration of these nations. Today, the Fang account for approximately 30% of the population of Cameroon, 40% of the population of Gabon, and they are the ethnic majority in Equatorial Guinea, formerly Spanish Guinea. A small number live in Congo-Brazzaville, the Central African Republic, and on islands including Bioko and São Tomé and Príncipe, largely as a result of colonial displacements and other colonial and post-colonial diasporic factors. In Rio Muni, the focus of this talk, the coastal areas were inhabited then, as now, by other ethnic communities, mainly the Ndogwe. One Fang narrative, Dulu Bombe Africara, or The Journey of the Children of Africara, authored by the Cameroonian author Ondua Ngutu and completed in 1948, traces the ancestry and genealogy of the Fang, described as a migrant people who arrived and settled in this region by the early 19th century. As historian Enrique Okembe has argued, European territorial borders represented one of the most conspicuous symbols of colonial domination in Africa. They were intended as an important form of containment and subjugation, impacting these societies' patterns of mobility. The Fang, nevertheless, confronted colonial intervention through a myriad of resistance mechanisms, reinforcing the role of the clan as a social unit and political authority, for instance, and overlooking the territorial colonial demarcations, strategies which, in the end, might even have contributed to a reinterpretation of what was understood as Fang ethnicity. In eastern Rio Muni, the Spanish colonial state kept administrative intervention at a minimum, leaving his role to individual settlers and the Claretian Catholic missionary order at least until the early 1920s, when labor demands in the Spanish plantation island of Bioko, then known as Fernando Po, and colonial infrastructure and engineering projects, roads, bridges, and administrative buildings, reflected in this 1942 map of the territory, accelerated relocations and enforced population shifts. It was under Ángel Barrera, the general governor for the Spanish territories, in his second term in office from 1910 to 1924, that the first forceful colonization of the Fang took place. This policy, the so-called pacification campaign, was then continued and allegedly completed by his successor, Miguel Núñez de Prado, who held the governorship position from 1925 to 1931. colonial military outposts were established, Fang communities were disarmed, the population was mobilized for public construction works, forced resettlements took place, and religious and educational systems under Claretian control were disseminated more broadly. The late 1920s and 1930s surely had been particularly harsh for the Fang of Rio Muni, marked by mandatory drafts, displacements, dispossession, various assimilation strategies, and a myriad of other forms of colonial violence. Governor Miguel Núñez de Prado toured the colonial territories over the course of 3 years, from September 1926 to 1929, entrusted with the mission to consolidate his pacification and the formal incorporation of the Fang communities under the Spanish geographic demarcations. He documented his tour in several ways, including with a sizable photographic album, bearing witness to his sojourn and that of his entourage throughout the Spanish colonial possessions, both insular and mainland. These photographs primarily featured the staged welcome by the different communities at which they arrived, like this one at Micomecén, as a way of memorializing their formal incorporation into the colonial ages. There are 3 photographs in particular which capture my attention. These visual takes from different levels of proximity of the same material display are an assemblage carefully arranged in front of the camera and displayed in the middle of the backyard of the governor's palace in the colonial capital city of Santa Isabel. They are a number of objects. They include locally crafted furniture, ethnic statuary, and hunting items. Not all of them are Fang. The cushions are identified as Hausa. The table piece is a Yoruba fertility representation, and the origin of the leopard and the elephant hunting trophies from Rio Muni is certain, since these were widely traded among Europeans in that region in the 1920s. The 3 photographs were taken at the end of the tour and are correspondingly featured in the last pages of the album. Independently of the means and purposes by which each individual piece on display was acquired, I want to interpret them as a metaphor of the spoils of this tour, partially emblemizing on a material and iconographic level the incorporation of the Fang under Spanish colonial rule. The objects on display are only a sample of the large collection of such items that Núñez de Prado collected during his stint as governor in this context of intensifying colonial subjugation. This massive collection of artifacts, many of them gathered among the Fang, include pieces entrusted with high spiritual and community value for the Fang themselves, such as the vieri or statuary holding ancestral relics. This collection became part of the same Museo Etnológico y de las Culturas del Mundo in Barcelona, and it is one of the most important holdings from this region. It has been catalogued with Fang elements, drawing side by side by the drawings of Jordi Sabater EP. It serves to trace the genealogy of private and institutionalized practices of colonial violence and dispossession, both physical and symbolic. Fan iconography in general, including forms of body embellishment and body marks such as scarifications and tattoos, was a constant source of curiosity and interest among colonial expeditionaries, travelers, and administrators alike. Juan Bravo Carbonell, a planter with investment in the oil business, includes photographs and descriptions of some of his iconography in several of his publications from the 1920s onwards. Tattoos were also the interest of impromptu ethnographers, such as Emilio Guinea, whose works were commissioned by the Spanish Geographic Society and the Ministry of Agriculture in the 1940s. Fan tattoos covered the pages of later traveler accounts too, such as Xavier Adros in the 1960s. But tattoos, like many other forms of fan body ornamentation, were progressively disappearing by the 1950s and 60s. The anthropologist James W. Fernandez, who conducted exhaustive fieldwork research among the Fan in Gabon in the 1960s, which will culminate in his massive volume on the ritual practices of the Bwiti, observes then, or at least those that by that point are not hidden under clothes, primarily in the elder men and women with whom he interacted. It is, however, a much earlier work that represents the most comprehensive and insightful work to date on practically all aspects of Fan culture. This work by the German ethnographer Gunther Tessmann was carried out at a time when the Fan were still practically unscathed by the pressures of European colonial forces. Tessmann had been trained in tropical botanical studies at a colonial school in Germany and was commissioned by the Lübeck Museum to conduct botanical and zoological research, but quickly developed a growing interest in anthropology and began to collect extensive ethnographic data among the Fan. Between 1905 and 1909, he conducted field research in what is now southern Gabon and Rio Muni, and completed 2 massive monographs on the Fan, published in 1913 as Die Pangwe. These include treatment of culture, history, religion, medicine, legal codes, the arts, and interethnic relations. His base camp, he had a team of 12 members, was called by the local Fan community Encolentangan, La Casa del Blanco, the white man's house, and was situated in the eastern part of Rio Muni, near the borders with Cameroon and Gabon. Tessmann's volumes, which are supplemented by maps and photographs, include long chapters on each of the Fan's forms of dress and body adornment, from headpieces to clothing to tattoos. He systematized the many patterns of tattoos and went into detail about the techniques and instruments used in their execution, the preparation of pigments, and the actual process of tattooing, including the body incisions prior to the application of color. Some of his photographs document the actual making of the tattoos. In general, he seems more interested in an empirical and technical approach than in engaging with interpretations on use, purpose, or cultural or artistic value. Jordi Sabater, in rendering on paper the Fang tattoos on exhibit here, does replicate some of the same impulses of his predecessors. His work might be best framed as part of a long trajectory of ethnographic renditions. Sabater lived in Rio Muni from the 1940s to the 1960s and self-trained himself as an ethnographer and naturalist. Hired by the Barcelona City Hall as director of a Center for Animal Adaptation and Research called ICUNDE, established in Rio Muni, he had close ties with the Barcelona Zoo and with the Ethnologic Museum. I am particularly interested in the itinerary that he followed, which is somewhat easily traceable by the dates and locations inscribed in the cards that accompany the tattoo drawings. I noticed, for instance, that most of the tattoos were from individuals described as being from cities like Ebebijin, which has two borders with Cameroon and Gabon, and other border towns of Rio Muni. Few are from the coastal areas, and some of them are from southern Cameroon. I am also intrigued about the interactions he had with the men and women whose tattoos he then reproduced, about the Fang terminology that he uses in his inscriptions, and the interpretation he makes of some of the designs. Finally, from a cataloging perspective, I am struck by the way that his fieldwork hand notes inscribed in the pages of the drawing notebooks are then interpreted, copied, and synthesized into the more sterile museum cards on display. Today, colonial collections such as these are under close scrutiny in Barcelona and elsewhere as scholars, activists, civil society organizations, museums, academic institutions, and government agencies attempt to critically contextualize them. One such ongoing initiative in Barcelona is the project entitled Traficants, Museums and Collections of Catalonia in the Face of Coloniality, whose interventions address several of the collections of the Ethnologic Museum, including Sabater and, of course, the governors that I mentioned before. Museums and archives are repositories of these processes of violence and accumulation. One of the above-mentioned team's objectives is the attempt to re-signify some of these collections with critical interventions to carefully trace both the origin and the conditions of acquisition or rendering of these items. Zoos and natural sciences museums are also part of this same circulation of objects and beings. Their post-colonial relationship, nevertheless, invites questions regarding ongoing symbolic violence, and so it seems pivotal for initiatives of this nature to incorporate, as you did, communities, collectives, and experts identifying as Afro-Spaniards or Afro-descendants, depending on the case. The impact of predatory colonial practices of extraction on local communities, individuals, and territories, the consequences of the deterritorialization and decontextualization of the materials being extracted, even if only of symbolic value, and the ethical dimensions of contemporary circulations, including the traffic of images from drawing notebooks to museum storages, to a classroom, to a web page, and to the walls of a center at an urban university in New York City, demands careful critical assessment. In this context, cross-territorial readings may be useful. Colonial territoriality often clashed with the will of African societies to maintain long-standing social relations across the social spaces that existed before colonial partition. The pre- and post-colonial transborder Fang ethnicity, for instance, calls for comparative colonial analysis instead of working with European political categories alone. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jane. I'm really delighted to be here and want to thank Jordana for the invitation and Jorge for the prompt to think through colonial archives, their legacies, and the different kinds of work that's required. It would be remiss of me not to begin by recognizing the colonial territorialities that we have on Lenape-Hoking. We're in the lands of the Lenape nations. The colonial forgetting of institutions, that includes universities, is perpetuated because colonialism is not of the past, this temporal component that continues to inform how we think and how we are and how we live in these spaces. These are Indigenous homelands. Within that, I want to say that the Lenape nations, the federally recognized tribes, are currently in 3 different states, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and also Ontario in Canada, and also state recognized tribes in New Jersey and also Pennsylvania. So my background is as a legal scholar, encountering and disrupting the kind of colonial legacies of property and authorship within the archive. On the one hand, this kind of work has made me attentive to the contours of power and in the kind of colonial collecting project itself. What was collected and documented, by whom, for whom. And they kind of continue to be kind of key questions that resonate for me in relationship to what the purpose of these archives are and who they were made for and who they continue to serve. These are kind of like unfolding colonial remnants of violence, of domination, and of intent. And they are contours that mark the colonial archive. On the other hand, what makes me, what I think about in relationship to colonial archives is the structural work that colonial archives do. Archives, libraries, museums function to shape memory, as well as our relationship to time. It's really important that colonialism likes to configure itself as a past problem, not a present problem that archives have to grapple with today and into the future. So this is not only what gets displayed, but also the representational work that is undertaken in that display. Because it's also about the framing and the construction of memory and construction of meaning that is made possible within these sites and the different kinds of authority that institutions maintain around those constructions of meaning. The archive is not a neutral space. It is not a place of memory. It is about past mastering. And it carries and remakes these colonial relationships consistently. So what matters to me when I think about archives is thinking about their structures, how they function, the conditions under which they function, including the archival tools, the catalogue structures, the ways certain names are remembered and certain names are forgotten, what becomes important in the catalogue record and what is not important in the catalogue record, and what gets categorized as an other field. Colonial archives are notorious for their lacks. What is deliberately missing? What is obscured? What is hidden? And this is not only a people problem, because it is definitely a people problem, it is also an organizational, informational problem. So my work is not in Equatorial Guinea or in Spain directly. I do work internationally in colonial archives around the world. But my direction is a little bit different in the sense that I don't come to collections to research them. I come to collections to find them for the Indigenous communities that I work for. So I come to find the collections that were created by researchers, that were taken or that were stolen over these long periods of colonial history. So for example, one community that I work for in northern Maine, their cultural material is in 70 institutions in this country alone. If I add to that the Spanish and the French histories that inform that community over these long histories, it's exponentially increased. That is generations of work to find their collections. And as a good instance of part of the problem, at least in this country, I'm going to talk about the American Indian Records Repository. I don't know if any of you have heard of that location. It's a 78-mile underground facility in limestone caves in Kansas that holds over 750 million pieces of paper relating to Indigenous history in this country. So for those of us who might have difficulty working out miles and kilometers, 78 miles is almost the distance between New York City and Philadelphia. That's a lot of documents underground. And it seems kind of ironic that it's underground and hidden and you can't get access to it. So for me, it's not just the size, it's also the content. I've worked with tribal nations locating valuable language materials across multiple institutions. I've worked returning sound recordings that haven't been heard for 150 years back to communities. And my current project involves working for the White Earth Nation on boarding school records. These archives hold generational trauma and colonial crimes. As White Earth works to kind of understand what has been held away from White Earth Nation by the monastical organizations that ran these boarding schools, the work is not just to bring these records back to communities, but also to develop strategies for access into the future. One of the challenges that I have in doing this work at the moment is not only the weight of the crimes that are in these archives, but also the current governmental interest in boarding schools and what lies within those spaces, and the desire for journalists to reprint images of boarding schools in newspapers without the consent of the communities in relationship to how that representational work is happening. It is really important to tell these stories, but these stories have to be told with consent. And they have to be told also from the communities themselves in the time that it takes to tell these stories. So what I kind of want to offer into this space is not necessarily what I want to offer into this space is maybe some of the big issues that I grapple with when I work within colonial collections. And I guess there's 4 of them, really. Access. What does it mean to access collections, and how difficult is access? So much of the work I do is supporting communities' access to collections that they know exist somewhere, but haven't been made transparent to those communities. So the work of making and disclosing collections, colonial collections, actually are institutional responsibilities. And how do you kind of change institutional behavior in relationship to making that access a paramount function of the institution? These collections were not made for these communities. These collections were made for very particular publics, but these communities were not the public. And what does it mean to transform these institutions that serve those communities? The second one is control. Who has control of these collections? And why does control matter? Control matters because if you don't have control over these collections, you can't make decisions about how they are shared and who they are shared to. Institutions hold enormous authority and control over these collections, not only in how they're accessed, but who comes into the archive to see them. So much work has been going on to provide control back to communities to be able to make these decisions about how these histories are shared and how the stories that created these collections are also shared. The third problem, ownership. Who owns these collections? And how do kind of particular colonial projects of property consistently remake themselves in the archive? Property and possession are persistent colonial problems. Property served colonial interests through the dispossession of land. Intellectual property serves colonial interests in the dispossession of knowledge. Property, real property, that related to land, and intellectual property, that related to knowledge, come from exactly the same philosophical foundations. Yet they're always kept apart, as if they are not related to each other, yet they foundationally are. So that work in terms of who owns these collections, both their physical property as well as the intangible digitized versions, run like a through line of property problems through the archive. And the fourth problem or issue is really about authority and authorship. Who is the author of these collections? And how is the author the one that is remembered, and the people's collections, who they are, forgotten? And how does that notion of authorship, who gets cited, who doesn't get cited, perpetuate the colonial conditions of power and authority? So for me, it's always really interesting to think about what do we actually learn from these museums about the communities that they tell us they represent. We have impoverished records. We have almost no information. We know kind of nothing. What we do know is actually a lot about the researchers, about the colonial project. But we cannot presume to know anything about those collections until communities are connected to them and the communities are speaking about those collections on their own terms, in their own time. So when I think about like what the work is that needs to happen within institutions around colonial collections, it's enormous. It is a reckoning. not only of who these collections are for, but the work that is required to account for how they have been presented and what kinds of knowledge production has occurred around them. Archives aren't memory. What we learn about archives are actually about the colonial project, the tools of the colonial project, the structures of the colonial project, and the ongoing life of the colonial project today. That's where I'm going to end. Thank you.
So first I want to thank Jorge, Benita, and Jane for giving us such a large amount of information to think about and begin our conversation. I also was remiss in my introductory remarks about recognizing our students who assisted. So I wanted to Bailey Foltz and Barbara Perez-Contiel from NYU who worked on the website, and Shiv Patel was one of our students who was here too. So I just wanted to give them the recognition that they so richly deserve. So as I mentioned, Kristen couldn't be here, but she sent some really important questions. So normally I have a lot to say and lots of questions to ask, but instead I'm going to limit myself to what Kristen sent in so that we have some time for you all to ask some questions before we take a break. So Kristen's first question. In looking at the images, I met several conflicting feelings, ideas, thoughts. As someone very interested in Afro-diasporic cultural practices, dress, adornment, I'm thinking how intimate, sacred of a practice this could have been amongst these tribe members, the tattooing, I'm assuming she means. And then also trying to reconcile the original illustrator, Sabbatary P's intentions. And I think the interesting choice of the title Fang Cabinet triggering for me the history of cabinets of curiosities, collections that were created around aesthetic concerns and interests in the exotic. And then the use of the language graphic catalog brings it further and further from my initial inquiry into the beauty of this intimate practice and into reinforcing and othering, where the Fang move from people to object and thing. So the question that Kristen is putting forward is, I'm wondering how each of you in your negotiation or in negotiating your positions, how do you negotiate your position as you engage with such complex material? That's, I think what Kristen really wants us to acknowledge is that we know that this is a complex terrain, and she's asking about how do each of you position yourselves. And she didn't get the benefit of our listening to your conversations, but I think it would be interesting to kind of make visible again the kind of difference in positionings as you relate to the project. So Jorge, or anyone can start.
If I understood correctly the question, my answer, my position is that is an archival position. I'm not a specialist on Fang. I browse archives and negotiate when I find an interesting archive, a conflictive one, with museums to activate them, normally through exhibition, as you know. And my position, I think, is a little bit different to the standard one, because I'm not involved with colonial studies or with post-colonial studies. I'm much more I'm closer to Jane, to these questions, to the problems she mentioned, not to the history of the Fang or to the problems of the Fang. Or I don't wanna be easy in this way, yet like no human, no taking care about the problems of human beings. But my work is about archival problems and problems of activating documents in exhibition. And this is my position.
Thank you. Jane, Benita?
Well, I obviously do not want to speculate on what these tattoos, scarifications, and these body marks, generally speaking, um, meant for the fan of that period, right? Which may even be different than what they mean for the fan today. It is not my role to do so, and I don't think it is the purpose of the exhibit either. But in reading the exhibit, in looking at the exhibit, on the one hand, I think it is very good that this material is being put into circulation. I very much like the webpage format, thinking of your questions of access, ownership, authorship, and so on. I think the webpage is a way of democratization. It opens it up to many publics in many locations, to fan as well if they want. And also the section of the webpage about interaction, right? At the end where it invites comments and reactions and so on. So I think it is great that this is being activated in that way. Now, if I am to judge what I see in the materials, as in all artifacts of this type, right, from the colonial period, of course, I am conditioned by the history that I know behind it. So it is impossible to disassociate it. But also, I see in a more kind of empirical way, if you want, the possible implied violence of the language used, the descriptions, right? The consent issues, of course. Some of the cards, right, say things like the lady was upset because I drove her, or she was upset that I was, right, or she left and didn't want to give me explanations, of course. Will not, right? And this kind of interaction, which is definitely a power relation, needs to be noted. So that is part of what I see with the material. And that doesn't mean that the material should not be exhibited, that the material should not be studied. I think it is precisely the point of all these projects, right? Engaging now with colonial archives. We need to unearth, right? We need to unarchive all these things and put them in dialogue. But I continue to see violence, yes.
Yeah. Jane?
I don't know if I have to add any more to what I've already kind of said, but I think that there's an interesting question that sits there in relationship to how do we understand these spaces as continued sites of colonial power? What do we do to disrupt that or kind of make that differently visible? So much of the colonial project is effort to hide the violence and the intent and the ongoing intent at erasure. And so I kind of think about how do you find projects that aren't just ones about glorifying particular kinds of research, but actually practice-based projects of change. And what does it mean to do that? How do you structurally change these spaces is very, very difficult, but it requires everybody to be thinking about it. And so for me, it's a little bit less about, I think, bringing it out and making that visible is part of the work, but it's actually also seeing the structural work that also has to happen.
Yeah, and it strikes me also it is about your position or our position, but it's also the position of those who hold the archive. And I think one of the observations that Estella makes in her interview is that the history that she was seeing in those cards is a colonial history, but a dictatorial history. And given the current state of affairs in Equatorial Guinea, I think for those from Equatorial Guinea who are living in Spain now, oftentimes are part of a pattern of migration, who might be multi-generational or might not, and that there is contemporary events in Equatorial Guinea that, are exercising continuation of some of that violence. And I think that's when you listen to Estella, I think she sees that in the historic archive, a resonance with the contemporary. And so I think that through line was, I think, very visible for her, that you can hear in her conversation with Jorge. Let me return to Kristen's question. She has 3 total. So the second one, a popular topic of discussion among my colleagues in what we've come to refer to as memory work is care. Specifically, what it means to think of memory work as a practice that goes beyond archival labor, so that we are engaging with the archive as archivists or researchers, and quote, we are thinking of ourselves more as caregivers bound to records, creators, subjects, users, and communities through a web of mutual responsibility, end quote, to quote archival scholars Michelle Caswell and Marika Sifor. I'd love to hear our panelists' perspective on this, charge to see archivists and historians as also caregivers grounded in a mutual work of repair, or if that is an issue to consider. I don't know. Do you want to, maybe we'll go reverse. Benita, do you want to start?
I'm happy to go first.
Good. Perfect.
I think about this in relationship to the practices within archives, particularly work that I've done around thinking about temporal sovereignty and what the possibilities of creating a slow archive is, and the relationality, responsibility, care that needs to sit there in any of this work, and that it is just going to take time, and that's actually in so much in antithesis to the project of digitization, and to make things as accessible and open as possible. And I think that there's a different kind of way that we need to think about these archives that isn't fast, that actually is slowing down some of the actions that we take for granted within an archival context, and thinking differently about what is the temporal reach, what kinds of histories and their lengths and depths are we dealing with, and what is the different kinds of responsibilities that arise within these spaces.
Yes, I think projects like this may serve as reparative works as well, right? Particularly, let's say, with a web page format, which allows for an ongoing engagement with the different communities, right, that need to engage with this material. And the violence that I was mentioning before, that most of the materials exhibit, right, to me by definition, might actually be part of this element that will help in the reparative work, because it creates discomfort about the past. And I understand that hopefully this discomfort, right, will move us to actions, right, to research, to other forms of engagement as well.
Perdona, que lo voy a traducir a Mara Jorge.
Sí.
La pregunta básicamente es que si se puede hacer el trabajo de archivero y a la vez como persona que ejerce cuidado, o sea, cuidadora o cuidador y archivador. Bueno, lo estoy haciendo demasiado sencillo, pero it's basically like, can you be an archivist and practice care? A caregiver as well as an archiver.
Yeah. Well, so I understood the question.
You did.
But I was not sure. I don't know if it would be a good answer, but question of care for me has to do with the question of co-creation of documents and creatorship. So archivist is not just the one who works with documents. It's a co-creator of the document. Each time that an archivist touches a document, is co-creating the document and changing the meaning. It means that it has a big relation with care. This is the moment when care has to be done, because otherwise we will go to the past condition of the archivist, the custodian of the documents, and forget that document is an alive record, is an alive item that is continuously being co-created.
Kristen has one more question for the group and then a last question for Jorge. So her third question, given the impact of colonial legacies in Equatorial Guinea and Spain on the archive, how might you advise those interested in engaging more deeply with this history? Have you encountered any roadblocks or any unusual silences? Benita, do you want to? You've done a lot of work on the archive in Equatorial Guinea in particular, maybe.
Well, I think this is a propitious time to engage with colonial history in Spain and everywhere else. In doing it for the last few years, I haven't encountered roadblocks. I think these materials, this type of exhibits, are an invitation for the general public to also engage with this type of subjects and this past history. And I think it is important to engage the Afro-descendants linked to these materials as well into the conversation.
Jane?
Yeah, so I don't work in Spanish archives or Equatorial Guinea, but the roadblocks of all the colonial other archives I've worked in are kind of pretty similar. There is this kind of desire to address the colonial condition, but not if it costs a lot of money. And the kind of like, we would like to change, but the inertia that then sits there in relationship to what that change would require, both in relationship to governance, decision-making, control, authority, is really like where some of these like real limits are. And I think that that's partly because so many of these institutions were founded upon, you know, ideas of the World Fair, ideas of the idea of a certain kind of display of culture and representation, and also who they were for. I mean, you don't have to go very far in New York City to find these exact same problems. And, you know, the response is kind of consistent. It's like, we would love to do better, but we need more money and we need more funding. And I have to say, that's not an excuse. Digitization was something that institutions complained about 20 years ago. We didn't have enough money for digitization. You actually have to change the workflows. You have to change who is responsible and who is in charge. And you need to get these collections back to the communities. And that is going to cost you money. That is reparative care. That is a reparations. And that's what institutions need to be doing.
Jorge?
Well, I will answer with, I'm not sure I understood the question, but
Yes, you do understand.
yeah, but then I know.
I can say it, otherwise it's
No, no, no.
or I can answer it.
Yes, you can answer, perhaps. No, not talking about money, which of course is the main problem, but I just want to tell an anecdote. At 4 o'clock in the morning, my telephone sounded. I have an Instagram account, and I had 4 messages from Barcelona telling me, I don't know what are you doing. I'm an anthropologist working in the Museum of Culturas del Mon, and I think what you are doing is very dangerous because you are showing drawings by Sabate P, which is not true, is by Barbara, and it's dangerous. So it's very symbolic, but people think that showing this stuff is dangerous because it contributes to make of Sabate P a saint, a hero of ethnographics. And this is a very, very, very big problem in Barcelona, that things are dangerous.
I think your eyebrow raise tells it all. But I think to add a layer, I think in the comments about the financial and the administrative blockades, in many ways those are the same engines that created these archives in the beginning with regard to extractivist economies. So that inversion of rationale, right? The rationale for the creation of these archives were often to undergird missions of colonial exploitation, which were to extract primary goods and enter them in the economy, and that they were done efficiently because of processes of administration that were finely tuned. So the irony of the argument against the lack of financial capital or administrative ease or technological burdens is ironic in a really violent way when we ask for a kind of renewed attention to what the conditions of production of the archive were originally. So I think that question of kind of, it sounds like an innocent argument. We just don't have the funds. And I think for this project as well, one of the conversations just to air out is that framing our research within a university context alleviated a lot of the mechanisms that I think allowed for an engagement with this material because it was under the auspices of an educational program undertaken by an independent private university in the United States. And I think often those kinds of initiatives can create a certain kind of grieta or a certain kind of crack that then might allow for other inversions in the project. So I think from the space of here and under the guises of an educational rationale, I think we were able to engage some of these questions in a way that they might not have been as easily engaged with if I were representing a different kind of institutional mechanism. And the liberation of some funds because it was under an educational auspice is also something that I think assisted in some of that digitization that the museum itself, didn't have. So like NYU paid for the private photographer to go into the archive and allow those pictures to be taken. There wasn't a prohibition against that, but there was an economic barrier to it.
I think also the way in which, going to what Jorge is speaking to here is a certain kind of authority of the researcher within the institution to hold certain kinds of legacy power. And so in many ways, this does speak into this kind of reality of how were these collections made? Where were the people working to make these collections? They were working in universities. And so this kind of stretch of the implication is actually quite long.
Yes.
And does reach into these institutions where we are as well. We're not outside it. It's part of the same kind of project.
Yeah. And Sabate P did hold a position in the Universidad de Barcelona through his specialty as a draftsman of nature and a primatologist, not primarily through the work that he did as an anthropologist, but rather by observing animals. So, thinking about that is also important. So I think the last question that we'll ask, and then I would love for us to move into the more informal space of the exhibition where everyone can continue the conversation that Kristen asked was to Jorge. And he wanted to know kind of what is your vision for this project? How would people stay engaged? But also where do you see the work that you're doing on this archive continue? And I think from our conversations, there are some possible future iterations of the work, and I wonder if you could share that with everyone.
Yeah. Well, the first step is to activate these documents in this way. The second step is to make director and curators understand that these documents matters. The next step is to digitalize it. The next step is to decide to use another software, another kind of software. It means to change the fields, to change the structure. I mean, it means to change everything, not to delete it, but to do it as Stella wish, together with the Afro-descendant community. So for me, this is this would be a very simple future, very human one, but this is what I'm trying to do, to activate in other fields this material, not only the exhibition, which is the easiest.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Benita, Jane, Jorge. Thank you all for attending. Please join us for reception now.